Hi everybody, Matthew here. Thanks for checking into the channel. Today we're going to talk some Jonathan Edwards. In fact, we're going to look at a particular period of Edwards' life that's very interesting, and that would be beginning in 1750 when Jonathan Edwards became a missionary to the Native Americans. Now, not a lot of people realize that Edwards was a missionary to the Native Americans, but nevertheless, that is true. Some people think more of Edwards for his famous sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, or perhaps some of his great treatises in theology like The Freedom of the Will. But yes, Jonathan Edwards was a missionary to the Native American Mohican Indians for a particular period of his life, especially towards the end of his life and just before his death. So we're going to talk about that today. It's a very interesting topic. Before we do that, let me really quickly invite you for the very last time. You got to do this right now, but you still can register for my Edwards lectures at RPTS, the Reformed Presbyterian Theological Seminary. This lecture is just Friday night and Saturday of next week, and you can just call the seminary straight away and get registered for that. If you're watching this sometime after January of 2025, the point is moot because the conference is over. I do want to tell you one more thing, though, that I'm kind of interested in right now. This is a bit of a digression, then we're going to get into Edwards' life here. Is I recently partnered up with a new program called Biblingo, which is a wonderful app that you can get on your phone to learn the biblical languages of Greek and Hebrew. If you ever desired to study biblical Greek or biblical Hebrew, or maybe you've already studied them and you want to recapture what you've lost, Biblingo is an awesome app. I've got it on my own phone myself. You can do Hebrew, you can do Greek, you can do them both, and you can get flashcards and all kinds of things that you can get right on your phone, your tablet, or your computer to study the biblical languages. If you're interested in that, I'm going to put a link in the description of this video, as well as a discount code. You can get 10% off if you put in Everhard 10 when you register for a Biblingo subscription. Okay, we'll talk more about that in future videos, but today we have bigger things to get to, and that would be we're going to go through some great material on Jonathan Edwards as a missionary to the Stockbridge settlement. Okay, by the way, I'm a scholar, so I like to cite my sources. Primarily what I use to comprise this particular teaching lecture is George Marsden's great book, Jonathan Edwards, A Life. It's one of the best biographies of Jonathan Edwards. I think I'll post that in a link in the description as well. And I want to let you know, too, some of the information that I got in this lecture is from the Jonathan Edwards Encyclopedia, which I happen to contribute to as one of the contributing scholars. Okay, so that's a great book. You should have that one on your shelf. Well, let's point it out here. So here's Stockbridge way over here. This is about as far west as you can get in Massachusetts. And you'll notice that about an hour away here is Northampton, up and down the river right here. Here's where Edwards spent the majority of his ministry in Northampton. But later on, after he was fired from the Northampton church, he had to move even further west. This would be going all the way out to like the fringes of society at that time, believe it or not, to take up this call in the Stockbridge settlement as a missionary. Now, let's talk a little bit about the history of the settlement and how it is that Edwards came there. First, we do have to understand a little bit of the context here, that there was a great amount of competition between the Protestants and the Catholics to win the hearts and minds of the Native Americans. In fact, you probably already know this, but the French were deeply Catholic, and they sent a lot of Jesuits and other missionaries to convert the Native Americans to Catholicism, especially sent by France. And likewise, England was trying to do something similar, only with Protestantism, trying to win the hearts and the minds and the trust of the Native Americans for the sake of the Anglican or congregational or independent churches as well. So we have this kind of tension here, which almost always works negatively in history, especially American history, because you have these two competing factions, two sort of brands of Christianity, and they're both competing for the hearts, the lives, trading, lands with the trust of the Native Americans. Very often this did not work out very well, and we're going to see a little bit about that not working out well in this particular period that we're going to cover today. Now, the Stockbridge mission was the idea of Governor Jonathan Belcher in about the 1730s. And the idea here was that to evangelize the Native Americans, or whichever tribes they were specifically, whether it was the Iroquois, the Six Nations, whether it was the Mohicans, the Mohawks, etc. One of the ideas was to Christianize them is the same thing as to civilize them, an idea that would obviously be very controversial in today's universities, for instance. But the idea is if you could put English Christian Protestants living together with the Native Americans in the same settlement, then the Native Americans would see the superiority of that English civilization, culture, literacy, society, and of course the Christian faith as well, and they would desire that for themselves. So that's kind of part of the idea here that they were thinking of in these days. And so the Stockbridge settlement was this idea that we're going to start a new town. It's going to be about an hour, an hour if you're driving, right? 55 miles west of Northampton. And this community had the idea that it was going to be a model community for English and Indian co-living together in one particular area. And so the Stockbridge settlement was founded in 1736 to 39, and there was a sponsor for this idea, and that was the Massachusetts Commission for the Propagation of the Gospel. And there was a lot of missionary societies like this in those days, which either sent out or funded various missionaries or Bible translations or Bible printings or tracts or things like that. And so the Massachusetts Commission for the Propagation of the Gospel was sort of a co-sponsor with this idea that we would start the settlement, which would be a model settlement for the English and Indians living together. Now, the first missionary that they sent, actually there was a pair of men working together on this project. One of them is called John Sargent. He's married to a woman called Abigail Sargent. Put that name in your memory banks because we're going to come back to Abigail Williams Sargent in a bit. She actually figures into the story quite significantly. And so John Sargent was the primary missionary to be something like the pastor of this community. The community needed a pastor. All communities were built around churches for the most part. And so to have a pastoral missionary as sort of the centerpiece figure of this community was the basic idea what they were trying to establish here. Now, alongside of him is Timothy Woodbridge, who's going to be essentially like the headmaster of the school. Part of it is that they're going to evangelize, start up a church, start up a town, but they're also going to have a school that's going to serve the dual purpose of educating the Native Americans, especially in English and reading and literature and agriculture and so forth. Now, all of this figures in prominently here in as much as the founders of this particular town were mostly all connected with either William Williams and or Solomon Stoddard. Now, in those days, these are the big heavy hitters. William Williams was a pastor that was friends with Solomon Stoddard. In fact, they were both part of the Hampshire Association of Churches, of which Jonathan Edwards was also a part. But there were also something like the movers and shakers, the heavy influencers in those days. And so almost everybody that goes out to Stockbridge has some kind of a connection with the Williams or the Stoddards. Now, Jonathan Edwards, of course, was the grandson of Solomon Stoddard, and he was also the co-pastor with Solomon Stoddard before Stoddard died. But the Williams family, not so much with William Williams himself, but the other descendants of William Williams are going to be a family that particularly gives Jonathan Edwards some tension and some troubles back in Northampton. And that trouble, unfortunately, is going to come back to Edwards when he eventually moves to Stockbridge. Okay? Remember, all of these people, they kind of knew each other. They were kind of like clan families, and some of them were intermarried, and so rivalries and tensions and resentments would often loom large in this day. Now, unfortunately, what happens to the first missionary, John Sargent, is that he dies at a rather young age. So in 1749, he's only been at this for about 10 years. He dies at the age of 39, which is very young. And that's going to put his widow, Abigail Sargent Williams, in a unenviable position of living on the frontier, but now lacking a husband. And so she becomes the most eligible bachelorette that is on this Stockbridge sort of experimental town. And she's going to find herself entwined in various troubles, as we're going to see as we go throughout. So to this point, on the early on, you have really only 4 white families that are willing to do this. And so they go out and they're living on the fringe, the edges of society, in danger, often under the danger of threats of invasions or raids or various things like this. And so they get together this boarding school for the Mohicans. That's the primary tribe that they're going to work for. And the Mohawk children, which was a distinct tribe. I know that Mohican and Mohawk sound the same, but they're actually 2 different tribes. And their goal is to win the hearts of the Mohawks again, because the Mohawks are going to be part of this larger Iroquois confederation of the 6 nations. And so it seems like advantageous for them to not only serve the Mohicans, but to try to entice some of the Mohawk children to come to their school as well. Now, the early times under Sargent and his partner Woodbridge seem to be rather successful. So by the time that Jonathan Edwards is going to come to Stockbridge, they already have about 218 of the Indians in the church. 125 have been baptized and 42 are communicant members. Now that's really successful by any standard. And by the way, if you're wondering about the term Indians here, I know that some people will have quibbles about language and whether we should call them Indians, Native Americans, or First Peoples. I'm going to go ahead and use the term Indians for two reasons. First of all, because that's the term that's more commonly used in Edwards's day. So I'm not trying to be offensive necessarily. I'm just trying to use a term that was colloquial back in those days. But then secondly, in the George Marsden biography, which I referenced, he is very comfortable using that term. And he's one of the greatest Jonathan Edwards scholars that's done work in Edwards. So I'm just going to follow suit there. I don't mean anybody any harm if you don't like my terminology. Okay, next. How then did Jonathan Edwards come to the Stockbridge settlement? Well, he was fired from the Northampton Church in 1750. And all of that was very, very painful for Edwards because he was a very leading thinker, theologian, revivalist, very well known in those days. But Edwards shifted his position on the Lord's Supper. When he came to Northampton, he was first willing to agree with Solomon Stoddard, his grandfather's position on a slightly more open table communion. It's not exactly what people do today. But Solomon Stoddard was willing to admit people to the table on a somewhat of a broader basis than many of the congregational, Calvinistic, or independent-minded churches in those days. Edwards feels that he should kind of move back to a more restrictive position of people who are able to give solid, credible testimony of conversion, rather than merely being a person whose life is generally regarded as above reproach. Now, when he does that, unfortunately, that's going to cost him his reputation in Northampton, and eventually he's going to lose his job. He's going to be voted out of that. Awkwardly, Edwards stays for a year as a guest preacher in the church that just fired him, while he's trying to figure out exactly what to do and to sell his home. And so basically the offers for Edwards, or the opportunities on the table, are these. Either A, he can go to Europe because he's got some invitations from Scotland, amongst other places. B, he could possibly start a rival congregation in Northampton. He did have some people from the Northampton church that were keen to him staying on, but he didn't really feel comfortable doing that. Or he could try to find a church somewhere in the colonies that was more amenable to his more restrictive position on the Lord's table, a prospect that he was a little bit skeptical that he could find a church that agreed with him exactly on that area. So Edwards, like he has done in previous times, he convenes a council of ministers to help him discern, and their best advice is that he should go to Stockbridge and take up the work that John Sargent was unable to complete because of his untimely death. So Edwards arrives in Stockbridge in July of 1751, and he basically takes over as the pastor missionary to this town or village. Now, although we might think of this as something like a demotion for Jonathan Edwards, he's no longer a pastor of one of the more prominent churches west of Boston. He does have a real desire to do Native American or Indian missions for the following reasons. First, his grandfather, Solomon Stoddard, for whom he worked as an assistant or associate pastor, was an ardent advocate for evangelizing the Native Americans. And so, working with his grandfather, he would have picked up a bit on that desire to reach the peoples of that native area with the gospel. And so he would have inherited something like that desire from his grandfather rather. But also his friend, David Brainerd, had recently died, and Jonathan Edwards did a very compelling biography of his journal, putting that together. And so Edwards is undoubtedly moved by some of the materials that he's putting together therein. And more to that same point, Edwards generally holds what today we would call a postmillennial position, meaning that Jonathan Edwards is an ardent advocate that the gospel is going to be successful as it permeates the various nations, and in fact Christianizing those nations as those nations will turn to the Lord Jesus. Just as individuals get saved, so also nations should turn to the Lord as well. And so Edwards's postmillennialism figures in here prominently for the most part along those same lines. Now, let's talk a little bit about Edwards' role and duties as the mission leader here. He had several duties that were very important. First, primarily, he was to teach the Mohican children to read the Bible. We're going to talk about Edwards' views here of the Native Americans themselves in just a moment, but primarily, it's hard to establish or to advance the Christian faith if you're not able to read or teach the Bible. So Edwards goes with the intention of teaching the Bible. Next, he's going to preach to the English congregation. Those 4 families are going to grow into several more and several more after that. And hopefully, as the English contingent grows, Edwards will serve as their faithful pastor. And he will also preach to a separately gathered Mohican congregation through a translator, who we'll mention here in just a few moments. And then he's going to work with Timothy Woodbridge to help to manage the school, as I push pause on my notifications here and turn silent mode on, okay? After that, we should talk then a little bit about Jonathan Edwards' view. Now, the word savages here I have in quotation marks. And again, I just want the viewer to understand here that this is a term that was commonly used in those days, though obviously would seem very offensive to modern hearers today. Okay, so I'm not trying to offend anybody. I'm just trying to share. This is what Edwards would have used because they thought that the Native American peoples were very, very uncultured, very uncivilized, especially in their lack of Christianity and their lack of literacy. And so part of the reason Edwards comes is because he feels genuinely moved to do something about that plight. Edwards is something of a cultural elitist, you do need to understand, and so he truly believes that English culture is better than the culture of the native peoples, no question about that. In fact, he would say that they lived in heathen darkness, and he certainly wouldn't be even shy of stopping short of calling them a culture and even a lifestyle that's given over to the devil or to Satan or to the powers of darkness. Edwards believes, and I share this with him, that Christianity is truth. It is the true faith. It is the true revealed religion. And Edwards then, acting on that impulse and working from that base conviction, is going to try then to evangelize the people, to bring them out of the darkness of Satan and into the gospel of light. And so Edwards believes, in as much as he's able to understand the native languages, which is not very far, others had made much further ground than Edwards in studying these languages, he doesn't really think that Native American, Native Indian languages are capable of conveying divine truth. And so Edwards' preference here would be that we teach them to read in English so that we can teach them the Bible, okay? It's not that he would be opposed necessarily to translations of the Bible in native languages or dialects, but rather he thought for the conveyance of divine truth, it would be better to go ahead and to teach them English rather than to learn their language and sort of work in the other direction. All that being said, and as offensive as some of it may sound to modern hearers, please understand that Edwards has a very high view of Indian potential. He thinks of them as being essentially co-equals in terms of the imago Dei, or the image of God within all of us, and that he has very high hopes that some of them might eventually become very great thinkers and theologians. So while he's a cultural elitist, he's not necessarily a racial elitist at all. And it's probably wrong for us to impute that motive to Jonathan Edwards, okay? During his entire time at the Stockbridge Reservation, we can probably say that Edwards had to go through quite a bit of difficulty and even suffering. No question about that. First, the Williams family brought quite a bit of tension from Northampton to Stockbridge. Tensions, resentments, and jealousies that are far deeper than I can get into in this particular video, but nevertheless did hamper and crimp Edwards' attempts to evangelize and to teach and to grow this little settlement, even as petty jealousies and rivalries seem to be impeding him all the while. And not only that, and this is where the story gets a little bit ugly, and even uglier here as we go on for a few minutes, probably there was quite a bit of manipulation of the Indians for the sake of the land. There was one particular Williams called Squire Ephraim Williams who was very keen and adept at acquiring Indian lands for cheap prices and building his own real estate empire based on his ability to negotiate in terms that perhaps were not entirely comprehensible. He's just very good at that, but good, I mean, in a very bad way. And so even amongst those, the whites there, the Christian colonists, there is something like a battle even within the Stockbridge colony to win the trust of the Mohicans. Obviously, some rum and bad trades are going to get involved, as you've probably heard in a lot of stories like this. And even Edwards himself, though, is going to be hampered by his own financial difficulties, especially the slow sale of his wonderful house that he had back in Northampton. So not only did he lose his job, but he's got to sell the house, and he doesn't have a new house in Stockbridge. So it's going to be a bit of a problem for Jonathan Edwards, and his financial difficulties followed him from Northampton to Stockbridge. Now, let's talk about this very interesting character here, Abigail Williams Sargent Dwight. That's a lot of names. Her maiden name is Abigail Williams. You will recall that I told you earlier to tuck her name in your memory bank because she's the first wife, or she is the wife of John Sargent, the missionary, the pastor. When he dies, she becomes a very eligible bachelorette living basically out there in the wilderness at Stockbridge with just a few other families. As other pastors are considered for the possibility of the role before Edwards, she takes a liking at least to one of them, Ezra Stiles, who she tries to coerce not only to come out to be the pastor, but her new husband as well. Unfortunately for Ezra, he doesn't take up the offer and he does something else with his life. But when Brigadier Dwight comes out, Abigail is quick to marry him, even though he's 25 years older than her. But you can understand perhaps her insecurities, even though she's beautiful and brilliant and young enough to remarry. She marries a guy 25 years older than herself, but at least he brings stability and probably some financial help as well. Now, what's interesting about Brigadier Dwight is that he was, first of all, a very close friend with Jonathan Edwards. And in fact, Edwards was pretty excited about Brigadier Dwight coming out because he thought of him as maybe kind of like a strong patron that could help fortify his own position, even as John Stoddard, or Colonel Stoddard, had done back in Northampton. But what happens is when Brigadier Dwight marries Abigail Williams, and remember the Williamses and the Edwardses have beef, she's able to turn Dwight against Edwards, and he becomes, with her in alignment, his rival. Okay. Now here's where it gets even uglier. Abigail, she's brilliant and beautiful and smart, but also very cunning. And she's a keen businesswoman too. And unfortunately, what she does is a little bit unseemly, probably even significantly unseemly. And that is that she begins to use mission support funds for her own gain. For instance, one of the things that she does is she uses mission support funds to build a girls' school on her own property, thereby amplifying the worth of her own property. And she would do things like this. And along with the other Williamses, especially Squire Ephraim Williams, she built for herself a pretty nice little empire of real estate, and always to her own financial advantage. Now, even though she's a Christian, at least ostensibly so, she tends to see the Stockbridge settlement as something like a financial venture rather than a missionary outpost to reach lost souls with the gospel. And that's going to be part of the tension that Edwards has. Now, I'm going to be honest. You know I'm an Edwards fan, right? Because I'm an Edwards scholar. And I'm going to be completely honest here and tell you that when modern scholars look back on the tension between Abigail Williams, Sargent Dwight, and Jonathan Edwards, they usually find in favor of the latter, Jonathan Edwards, because Jonathan Edwards does seem to have much purer motives as it relates to the very good of the Mohican people. He will often help them to negotiate when it comes to land or other treaties. He definitely seems to have a very positive idea of what the Mohican people can be if they can convert to Christianity. And he seems to be one who's willing to risk, at least to some extent, his own reputation to advance the reputation of theirs. Okay? So Stockbridge almost comes to a point of ruin because of this tension. Why so? Well, because both factions, the Williams-Dwight faction, is competing with Jonathan Edwards for the trust of financial supporters in Boston. And so both of them, what they're doing is they're trying to say to their financial supporters, we're doing it right. The other team is the one that's cheating or lying or stealing or whatever. And so they have this kind of constant conflict in which they're trying to convince those with the heavier wallets to continue to support the ministry, but always to their own advantage. And so that's a bit of a problem here. In my understanding, Abigail here has a complete category conflation between mission and for-profit business. I don't think she ever really distinguished those things in her mind. At one point, even, there's a mysterious and suspicious fire that breaks out in the boys' school. Remember, Woodbridge is the one who's in charge of that. Abigail starts the girls' school. And some people even suspect that it might have been something like a sabotage in order to diminish the work of the Edwardian side of the dilemma and to amplify the position of Abigail's side. Now, who's the losers in this? Well, the Indians are losing confidence in everybody because they see this as squabbling amongst themselves. And so the Mohawks, who they were very keen to try to win to the settlement, eventually they end up departing from the school, and not much further is really done there, and a lot is lost. So it ends up something like a war of attrition between these two factions. And how do we ferret this out today? Well, we could probably say that Abigail won as far as land and money goes. That was her main goal all along. But Edwards did seem to win out as it relates to the trust of the Mohican people, and certainly a real support for the mission as a mission. Okay, the big losers, probably the Mohawks, who got upset and left. Some of the Mohicans stayed. Some good was done, as we're going to see here in a few moments. But for the most part, it seems like the Mohawks, who basically took their baseball mitts and left the field, were the ones who were kind of the big losers of this sad squabble. All right, now, what else can we say here? Well, certainly we can talk of the heroism of Jonathan Edwards for going here in the first place. There is no doubt that every single one of these people were subject to real physical dangers at the Stockbridge settlement. The further you are on the fringes, the more exposed you are to attacks. And there were a number of attacks in those days. You have all kinds of tensions between the British and the French, between the Protestants and the Catholics. You have the French and Indian War. You have rather frequent Indian attacks. And you have, of course, intense illnesses, of which Edwards himself was subject. One of the things that you know if you follow Edwardian history is that Jonathan didn't necessarily have the strongest physical body. He was tall and thin, but often subject to illness. And so he did get sick here some pretty significant times while he's out in Stockbridge. And not only that, but Jonathan Edwards and Sarah, his wonderful wife, who by all accounts is just a beautiful person and a wonderful character, they do have to spend some bit of time apart from each other, even as one will be in Northampton and the other in Stockbridge, or vice versa, sometimes going to Boston, sometimes preaching out, sometimes caring for their children. And one of the things that we know is that Stockbridge was considered so dangerous that Jonathan and Sarah were not even quite comfortable having all their kids there. So very often their kids are in different places. And that's certainly a hardship to deal with if you're in ministry. Okay. Now, talking about Edwards' preaching here, some scholars think that Jonathan Edwards' preaching was actually some of the best he'd ever done. Now, I happen to think that all of Edwards' sermons are wonderful, at least most of them are. But here in Stockbridge, what Edwards does is he simplifies his sermons. He re-preaches quite a few that he'd done in Northampton. He preached with simple images, stories, and pictures, a lot of times preaching out of Matthew's gospel or Luke's gospel, with a lot of focus on the kindness and the mercies of God. And so these make really beautiful and wonderful sermons. Edwards did have to think about the fact that they had to be translated. And if you've ever preached with a translator before, you know how hard that is, because you say something and then the translator says something and vice versa. You got to keep taking turns. So Edwards really simplified his sermons. And more to that same point, he was also working on some major treatises, so he was pretty happy to be able to preach some simpler sermons here. Some people think that Edwards was preaching at his highest peak here, that this was some of the best content that he had done. Okay, so there's that, and you can read some of these sermons if you get into the annals of Edwards' work. Now, Jonathan has a translator who himself is a significant character in the story. His name, and I'm going to try here, Wawampekwanat is his name. John Wawampekwanat. He's actually pretty important because this Native American, this Mohican Indian, he is formerly the translator of John Sargent and David Brainerd, and he's one of the best Indian theologians that was available in those days. He was excellent at reading, excellent in writing and speaking in English, He did have one weakness for alcohol. Of course, that probably has to do with a lot of these trade negotiations where rum was thrown in at pretty high volume. So there was a little bit of that to work with. But his own story, Wawampikuinat's story, is pretty interesting because he ran away from home as a child, and he ended up coming to Stockbridge. And first, he kind of works his way up into this position, first as an usher in the school, maybe doing some basic duties of sweeping or keeping the doors or whatever he did. But as he learns and understands more and more English, he becomes very, very helpful and useful to the English-speaking missionaries. And he's also one who's taken up in the cause. He'll end up fighting for the English or the Protestant side in the French and Indian War. And his son Daniel, Wawampikuinat, now it's just fun to say, he fought for the Americans in the Revolutionary War. So he himself is an interesting kind of a digression topic if you ever want to study that. Well, how does Edwards' time at Stockbridge come to a close as we begin to wind this video down? Well, first, Aaron Burr, Edwards' son-in-law, who married Esther, his daughter Esther, he dies. He's the president of the College of New Jersey, aka Princeton. And the college then offers the presidency to Jonathan Edwards. Now, at first, Edwards is, again, reluctant to take up a new call. But once again, he goes back to his pattern of gathering up a few ministers, talking to them, and ends up taking their advice to take the call to the presidency. Unfortunately, if you've watched my video, The Death of Jonathan Edwards, he dies shortly after taking up the presidency from a smallpox inoculation. Now, interestingly, here's a bright spot in the footnotes. His own successor, the guy that's going to come to Stockbridge next, Stephen West, apparently had a pretty good run, and he ends up staying at Stockbridge from 1758 to 1818 and ends up bringing some real stability to some of the chaos during the Abigail versus Jonathan tension that they experienced in the 1750s. Okay, so some wrap-up lessons here about Edwards and his moment 7-8 years as a missionary to Native Americans. What are some takeaways for us? Well, first, Edwards really is, and he does come across as a true advocate for the Indians. There's no sense in which Jonathan Edwards is seen here as a malevolent figure who's come to manipulate the tribes, either the Mohicans or the Mohawks or the Housatonics or anyone else. He does seem to be here a fairly benevolent missionary force, even as much as he truly believes that the Indians need to come to saving faith in Jesus, just as I would believe that today. Now, while he's there, praise God, Edwards writes 4 major treatises that are going to be very important works in the Edwardsian corpus. He's going to write The Freedom of the Will, and he's going to write a document on original sin, and a major treatise on the end for which God created the world, or the purpose why God made anything, and then finally the nature of true virtue. These last 2 here are kind of a set. They come together. More to that same point, when we're thinking about his legacy and lessons, we do find a couple of things that are pretty interesting here. Jonathan Edwards Jr., okay, his son, one of his younger children, ends up being fluent in native languages, and he's going to eventually go off as a missionary with Gideon Hawley, who was one of the boys' school teachers, to missionary wilderness, okay, wilderness missionary work, I should say. Gideon Hawley loves the Lord, wants to evangelize, and so he asks for permission to take this boy, Jonathan Edwards, who really speaks well. As you probably know, children end up speaking better than adults do. And these 2 are going to go off and do some missions work. It is notable that the school educated both girls as well as boys, which is kind of a concept a bit of ahead of its time, so we can say that. Further, we can say that Sarah Edwards, Jonathan Edwards' wife, was very much beloved, trusted, and highly regarded by the Indians. So that's wonderful. As opposed to Abigail, who is, a bit of a character, as we've seen. They taught the Indians singing, which I think is kind of a glorious note here. And Jonathan Edwards himself is pretty well known to have actually taught the Indian children himself the Bible personally and weekly. So Jonathan is seen as sort of a benevolent, caring, wiser pastor in the midst of this otherwise rather difficult setting here in the Stockbridge mission. All right. Well, hopefully that was educational for you. And if you liked this video, I have a bunch of other ones similar to it on my Jonathan Edwards playlist on this channel. I do want to just hit some notes here real quick before we sign off. My Jonathan Edwards weekend at RPTS, the Reformed Presbyterian Theological Seminary, is coming up next week. That is January 24 and 25 of this year, the year of our Lord, 2025. And I also just wanted to mention real quick, if you're interested in learning the biblical languages of Greek and Hebrew, you might want to check out Biblingo. It's a pretty cool app. I'm just kind of discovering it, getting into it. And I have some links in the description of this video if you want to try to get a subscription. It is a subscription-based service, but really helpful if you want to study Greek or Hebrew. Okay, that's it. That's all I've got for you today. 35 minutes, bit of a longer video, but I do love you lots. Talk to you later.